everyone, and I welcome Mr. Ian Bryce, who have come all the way from Australia to the Gothenburg Skeptics to do a presentation about the fantastic machine of Andrea Rossi. So give Ian a hand and wish him welcome to Gothenburg.
Well, thank you so much for the kind invitation to come and meet with the Swedish skeptics. It's so nice to meet with different groups around the world, and we haven't done much travelling lately, which makes it even more special. So my own background, I'm qualified in physics and engineering, and I'm currently the challenge investigator for Australian Skeptics. More about that later. And they're the two logos that Australian Skeptics have had over the years. You'll see there's a koala bear with a magnifying glass, and the other one is a map of Australia that looks like a question mark. You might not have picked up on those. So very briefly about Australian Skeptics, we'll talk about the origins, the events it holds, the publications. I'll keep that one short. And Australian Skeptics was created in 1980 because several famous people believed that there was a need for this in Australia, and they organised a water divining test, water dowsing. In Australia we call it divining, and that received great publicity on the television and attracted a lot of new people to the organisation. So I joined in 1981, and I always specialised in investigating claims involving science. So what does Australian Skeptics do? We have a monthly Skeptics in the Pub event, face-to-face, which was at a time on Zoom. We have speakers occasionally at a dinner, annual conferences. At the time I wrote this, we're on Zoom, but they're back to face now. Many overseas speakers, and the Skeptic Zone podcast, run by Richard Saunders, that you might know, and many online campaigns on specific issues. And we also have magazine, newsletter, Facebook, Twitter, podcasts, and on television, everything that we can use to forward our message. So the magazine, The Skeptic, comes out 4 times a year on paper and online. Back issues are free and searchable in case you want to look things up. And we exchange articles with the Skeptical Inquirer in the USA, and we have a monthly newsletter online, and I mentioned podcasts. We have merit awards for people who have done a very good job in promoting skepticism. We have Skeptic in the Year, of course. I understand you have some similar awards. And there's 2 awards given the names of famous skeptics who since passed away, but in their honour. And we have monetary prizes that we can hand out to deserving people, and we have an awards ceremony at the conferences. We've been fortunate to get quite a few bequests that people mention us in their will, so when they pass away they often leave us $500,000 or $1 million, which means we can support these activities very well. The Ben Spoon Award is probably the most fun. As presented annually, it has been since 1982, so that's 38 years. The first Ben Spoon Award had only the top tier of this diagram, and then we had to add a second tier, and now we've had to add a third tier, so 3 layers of skeptics. And the official title is that it's the perpetrator of the most preposterous piece of paranormal or pseudoscientific piffle. So in English that makes an alliteration where they all nearly start with the P, give or take some poetic license there. So every year we add a nameplate around that and award it to someone else. Some people have won it twice. The Ben Spoon Award, they're people that we come across, or they're nominated by our members, and the positive award winners get treated with courtesy and decency. The Ben Spoon winners, no way. And they're not invited to the awards ceremony. However, there was one famous person, Peter Brock, for his energy polarizer that was half the fuel consumption of your car. So at the time he had he campaigned for a petrol company and had cardboard cutouts of Peter Brock by the petrol bowser filling a car, so he presented the Bed Spoon Award to his cardboard cutout, which is the closest we could get. But enough about Australian skeptics. Getting on to the Rossi ECAT claim, exposé of a claimed cold fusion device, which of course has quite a few connections to Sweden, which is one reason I came here. So back at the start, there's an Australian called Dick Smith. Anyone heard of the Australian adventurer Dick Smith? A few, okay, not too many. He's famous for flying by helicopter to the North Pole and then around the world by helicopter. He's a philanthropist, means he made millions out of an electronics business back in the 1980s and 70s, and he now uses his money to support worthwhile causes to do with public education and skepticism. He published the Australian Geographic magazine, which was mirrored on the American National Geographic magazine that you might know. And it's still going after about 40 years, so that's not too bad. He supported many worthwhile projects, and he was approached to invest in a certain scheme by one Sol Millen, who wanted 500,000, that should read 500,000 euros, so he could buy the Australian rights to a device in Italy to a new source of unlimited energy. His name was Andrea Rossi, and his product was called ECAT. So this Australian entrepreneur prepared a prospectus to help him raise money, and he claimed on it things like, "We will save the planet, and we are the people we have been waiting for." Now, I don't know how good your grammar is, but that doesn't stack up to correct reading. We are the people we have been waiting for. And Dick Smith said, as he usually does, "Sure, that's great. If you can save the planet, I'll back that. This is the type of thing I can support. Just send me a report by a reputable scientist who has confirmed that it works." Fair enough. The problem was that a few days later, a report arrived by two distinguished Swedish physicists. So it seemed Dick would have to part with his €500,000 because he'd said he would. And then Dick Smith said, "I'm out of my depth, I'll call in the skeptics." So he got on the phone to me, and that's how it came across my desk originally. And this was the report which they sent. Extracts from it. Experimental test of a mini Rossi device in Bologna in 2011 with some distinguished participants there. And they said that they were gathered at a building where a 10 kilowatt apparatus for anomalous energy production was demonstrated, and so on. And the present test was done with a smaller device than the 10 kilowatt, and so on. And the extract from the conclusion is that, for comparison, 3 litres of oil or 0.6 litres of hydrogen would give 25 kilowatts of chemical burning. Any chemical process for producing 25 kilowatts from any fuel in such a small container can be ruled out. The only alternative explanation is that there is some kind of nuclear process that gives rise to the measured energy. Now, you might see that the Swedish scientists they didn't tell any fibs, they were just tricked by Rossi. So, and they published, that's them there, there's Rossi and Callender and Essen there, Rossi on the left, demonstrating his cold fusion apparatus. And about these two people, Hanno Essen was a Swedish theoretical physicist at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, and he's been the president of the Swedish Skeptics, a sister organisation of Australian Skeptics, and also with the Centre of Inquiry in the US. So Essen had read Rossi's reports and commented favourably. Sven Callender, who's since deceased, was an experienced nuclear physicist and has published some ideas of his own on cold fusion. He is chairman of the Energy Committee of the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences, which is involved in awarding Nobel Prizes. Nobel Prize. So, high qualifications indeed. The report was very impressive, factual and impartial. The scientists made very careful observations of the test, which lasted about 8 hours, and recorded a temperature history of the device and flow rates and masses and lots of things that were very useful to me later. And they had measured the energy coming out of the power point, because this device was plugged into a power point. And they estimated the energy output from boiling the water and steam quantities, and they estimated figures like 3,000 watts coming out of that. So this was a very weighty report and had a lot of credibility, and unless we could find a problem with this report, Dick Smith had promised to hand over €500,000 for the Australian rights to this. So that's why he asked me to investigate it. This is basically a simple diagram. Rossi was very reluctant to provide diagrams himself, but this was prepared by some other scientists that witnessed the test, and it's made of pieces of copper, like hot water plumbing, and it's got some electrical heaters in there, and the water's flowing in the left, flowing in the bottom and out at the top right, and in the middle there's a reactor chamber which claims to contain his nickel and catalyst and hydrogen, which creates the cold fusion. So that looked fair enough. And he also produced a theoretical diagram which his tame physicist called Widom-Larsen theory, four-step process, which was supposed to add some credibility. Now, not many people could disprove this on the spot, including myself, so we had to look elsewhere. But it essentially transmutes elements, but not by known processes. Rossi was so convincing that in total 17 scientists came out supporting ECAT, and I was under some pressure from Dick Smith to find the trick, if there was one. And Rossi even fielded 3 doctorate professors, or not professors, some scientists from NASA with PhDs. And this is a slide presentation from Dr. Zawodny of NASA, Goddard Space Research Center, showing how he was going to use this cold fusion device to propel rockets into space. Can you believe? So, if NASA believes it, and the Swedish scientists believe it, what could possibly be wrong? Typical comments from all the scientists there. We've examined every wire and pipe. We have calculated that hidden batteries, phase change materials or chemical reactions could not possibly account for this. Remember, it sat there producing about 3,000 watts of excess heat, over and above what the power point measured going in, for about 8 hours. It's a lot of energy. You couldn't produce 3 kilowatts of heat for 8 hours with any known means, batteries or chemical storage or phase change. The scientists said, therefore, we see no explanation in accordance with physics other than Mr. Rossi's explanation of cold fusion. So I made my own inquiries, and I had a clue. How did Rossi, with no scientific background at all, he had a degree in philosophy, not physics, how did he come up with a new method of nuclear fusion? And according to this book, An Impossible Invention by Mats Luan, which is in effect an authorised biography of Rossi, based very largely on conversations between the two, in there they admit that Rossi thought of it while languishing in an Italian prison for a previous energy scheme that did not work. Is that a good recommendation? Now, I have to say that, in fact, his conviction was later overturned in the interests of fairness. So that was called Petrol Dragon, that machine. And he had another scheme based on producing electricity by the thermoelectric effect, waste heat from diesel engines. Thus, anyway, we doubted that Rossi was legitimate and wouldn't pay up. And my investigations continued. But everywhere I found there were red flags raised. I went to visit Seoul, some distance away, and gave a joint presentation. And I concluded at the time, he made the mistake of inviting me to address his investors. Can you believe? Because he had no other credible person to address them, and at least I had some credibility. So I told him that the characteristics were more indicative of input electrical power being manipulated or the water flow being misunderstood than a real nuclear reaction. Sol was very disappointed, and he never secured any investors. So, how did it happen? This is what the scientists thought they were looking at. This is my diagram. They never produced a clear-cut description. In the left, you can see an Italian wall socket with active earth and neutral, same as anywhere in Europe or the world, 230 volts going in, 3 wires coming out, which travel to a blue box that does unknown things. Now, we can see that we'll talk more about the blue box shortly, and how the power was measured. But that's what the scientists thought they were seeing, and so the power in was 345 watts at this particular moment, and the power out was about 3,000 watts. So there seemed to be energy for nothing. And it came to me one night how he could be doing it, and if you can see, can anyone spot a difference between the two diagrams?
It's where you connect the ground.
Sorry?
Where you connect the ground.
Where you connect the ground, that's right. So I suggested that perhaps the earth wire was being misused and was being connected to the active wire in the pin in the power point. At the other end, it was going into some separate power supplies in the blue box. And hence the current flowing in the earth wire was not being measured, because the scientists, in their wisdom, measured the current in the active wire and the voltage between active and neutral. And an electrical engineer would know that that's how you calculate power with an alternating current. You multiply the two and you get the power. You're not used to you assume that the current in the earth wire is 0, but they didn't think to measure that. So anyway, I suggested that that was what could be going on. And then why were the scientists fooled? Of course, it's because they're not accustomed to being tricked. Scientists generally observe nature, and nature doesn't set out to trick you. Thus, Callender and Essen were, I think, unprepared for someone deliberately setting out to trick them. And there were some other observers who also made their own conclusions. One was that the amount of water and the amount of steam coming out were not accurately measured separately, so that could be another explanation. So, of course, a good hypothesis makes predictions. So my hypothesis was that the earth wire was being used by that means. And so if he was really smuggling in power through the earth wire, I know from lots of experience that there's an upper limit to the power you can draw through a normal electrical wire that's used to power something. And beyond about 3,000 watts, the wires start to heat up, and you can feel that they're hot, and they start to bubble the insulation. So there should be an upper limit of about 3,000 watts that Rossi could produce from the device. So I reverse engineered the data from the Swedish scientists, their carefully recorded measurements versus time as the device heated up, and found out by estimating the amount of copper in the device and the amount of water with specific heat in it and the amount of flow of the water, and all of these things, it's possible to estimate the excess power. And we found out that you can see there that the blue is the power for the water flow, the green is the power for the temperature rise, and the red is the power for vaporization of the steam. And if you add them all together, you find out it started off with about 700 watts of power, and then it leapt up to about 2,000 watts. Then there's a period where the power was 0, and then it leapt up to about 2,600 watts. So that's totally in accordance with current through the earth wire, because the limit you would expect is 3,000 watts before the visible signs started to appear. And the 800 watts was consistent with the power measured from the instrumentation at the time from the power point. So we figure that halfway along this graph, he turned on his extra power supplies, which drew power through the earth wire, and that produced the steam from the device. It also shows that there were periods where there was no excess power being produced, and I put that down to the fact that when he was doing the tests, Rossi was sitting at his blue box, controlling it, and if one of the scientists were free to walk around, and one of the scientists approached his measuring apparatus, there's a danger that they would lift off the clamp ammeter from the active wire and put it on neutral. So I suggest that that's where Rossi disconnected the current in the earth wire for safety in case one of the scientists took a different measurements. So that's circumstantial evidence, but it all eventually builds up. So that was my earth wire hypothesis. So we put out a press release, Dick Smith and I did, how Rossi misled the world through inadvertent miswiring of an earth lead. The lawyers, we have lawyer friends, and they suggested that in case it was a mistake, we put the word inadvertent there. And however, someone on the blog spheres wrote to us and said, "You idiots, that couldn't possibly be a mistake. It must be deliberate." And we said, "Thank you. I'm glad you said it and not us." And Rossi's response himself was very, very telling. He said, "Smith and Bryce are just Aussie roadkill." Do I need to translate roadkill? Animals, animals killed beside the road. So, and also Smith was a snake and I was his puppet snake. So we thought, could that be the reaction of a future Nobel Prize winner? No. So we called a fake, and we came out and said that. So at that point, Rossi could have sued us. So anyway, that's how we showed it to the world. And my first article on the topic was called "Going Cold on Fusion" in our local Australian magazine. And I needed to test the hypothesis, so I contacted all the 17 scientists who said it was legitimate that I could find, and I contacted these two and didn't get a response to my emails, so I rang them up eventually and said, "What I want to know is what you observed consistent with this explanation." And the most they said was, "I suppose it could be." So I think it's very hard for a scientist to backtrack. That's my only conclusion can be. Anyway, Rossi's not gone yet. He had a long string of successive advances on his device and continued with many different devices, and I gave up trying to disprove each one of them, because once you've shown someone that you think is cheating, then you can leave it at that. One hypothesis was that the electrical wires were really, in fact, coaxial cables. And in a coaxial cable, you can have the outer and the inner currents going in opposite directions, and an external ammeter will measure zero. But I knew very well as an electrical engineer that if you put all that current through that tiny little conductor, it would melt very quickly and catch fire. So another one was that, this is my favourite, one of the bloggers wrote that there was a powerful microwave transmitter sitting in the next room beaming invisible power into the device. All 3 kilowatts of it. Now the photo shows the scientists milling around with certain parts of their anatomy at the same level as the equipment. So you'd have to be pretty... You'd think they might detect something wrong. 3 kilowatts of power ending up in the device. How many kilowatts outside? At least 10 kilowatts, I'd say, which you might notice. So it went on and on and on. So just the aftermath, he attracted $10 million from a company called Industrial Heat for a demonstration. They would pay him if he gave a demonstration of a 0.5 megawatt device. Now, I said earlier that he scaled it up to 0.5 megawatt. Now, if we remember back to 1987, there were 2 scientists called Fleischmann and Pons who claimed to have cold fusion. And they were basically real scientists, and I think they were mistaken rather than cheating. But they claimed excess power of 26 milliwatts. You know how small a milliwatt is? But Rossi wasn't satisfied with 26 milliwatts. He claimed 500 kilowatts of excess power. So my understanding of science is it goes by incremental steps, not by orders and orders of magnitude in one go. Anyway, had they approached me, they would have saved their $10 million. Rossi pocketed the $10 million, and a lawsuit followed. They tried to get their money back, and he wouldn't give it, and he won the lawsuit. So he got his, kept the $10 million for the demonstration. By the way, the demonstration that he gave them, they weren't allowed to attend it. He just documented it and sent them the report. So, would you do that? I hope not. Anyway, so then I approached the Skeptical Inquirer magazine in the US, which had much wider circulation than their little Australian Skeptic. So this is the Skeptical Inquirer that has my article in it, which with other comments runs to 12 pages. So it was a major article which put down historically everything I've told you and much more. You need a lot of backup. The lawyers, they had good lawyers in the USA, and I had my Australian lawyers also said the truth is a defence in many jurisdictions, not everywhere, not China or Russia. Truth doesn't get you very far in those countries. But in Australia and the USA, truth is a pretty good defence. So we need to remove any non-factual material. And they said, imagine you're in court and you're challenged in court, and every statement that you've made, every sentence, they ask for your backup. You have to provide backup. So I created a website that had 20-odd documents in it providing all the backup to these claims, and that satisfied them. And then the lawyers in the USA eventually said, this is a high-risk article, but it's exactly in our core business of skeptical inquiry, so they okayed it. So it was printed, with a lot of bits deleted. And the backup styles were published on the Skeptics website, as I said, and list of the 17 scientists. So there's the article, and it's available freely online at Skeptical Inquirer if you would like to read it. And Rossi did not sue us, but he soldiers on with more and more ridiculous demonstrations, and they go on and on and on. And he's now got an LED that produces more light than it's entitled to from its electrical input. And most funny, on his website, he had 2 sock puppets. One was Leonardo da Vinci and one was Andrea Rossi, and they were congratulating each other on how clever they were. I highly recommend that, but keep a sick bag beside you, because I think you'll need it. So that's... And who else was fooled by Rossi? Brian Josephson was. Anyone heard of a Josephson junction? That's right. He is or was a respectable physicist, and he has had other ideas, but I was encouraged to write an article on the Nobel disease about where intelligent scientists go weird, which included many others. So that's separately available, which reflects many of my other inquiries into things for Australian skeptics. It was also called Nobel rot, because I don't know if you use the term here, but grapes have get a fungus on the outside which makes them very sweet, and it's called Nobel rot. So Nobel rot is a take on that. So, okay. If I've got a little time to tell you very quickly about some other Australian skeptics adventures that I've been involved in. That's our $100,000 prize. That's a real check. As I said, we've got money behind all this, and we'd love to hand it out. The amounts varied, but it's been $100,000 for a while. Other Australian groups have got other amounts, and it's to anyone who claims to have extraordinary powers, but they need to demonstrate their ability under proper observing conditions. The fields could be paranormal or psychic or supernatural, but I broadened it to include anything new to science. Because there are so many energy scams now. You might have noticed the world is in a bit of an energy crisis. And if you can come up with a scheme that reduces your electricity bill by 10%, then that's very, very worthwhile. And it also includes the ability to read minds or to communicate with extraterrestrials or to tell the future. So they apply for the $100,000 prize, or else we hear about them and approach them. If it's valid, they get the $100,000 and they get prestige and recognition. If it's really a discovery new to science, they might get the Nobel Prize, and we'd be very, very happy to be associated with that. If it's unfounded or fraudulent, we reserve the right to expose the situation and to always publish our results. So as I said, my background has been in radio communications and optical fibre communications, which is using electromagnetic laws. And my second career was in aerospace, which is basically about overcoming gravity. So, of course, electromagnetism and gravity are the main forces that govern our everyday life, which is one reason I find it interesting to pursue such investigations for the skeptics. So I sometimes claim that science has shown that there are no gaps in how the world works at a fundamental level, at least in the here and now. So we can be quite confident in examining many claims that appear to contravene the laws of science. There's a lot of people who think I'm going too far. Maybe I am, but this is my position as I understand it, and the starting position for investigating such claims. So the gaps that exist at a very fundamental level don't seem to affect the here and now. So we can be confident when we make claims. Some of the other things we've investigated over the years, I can mention some of these now if you like. Would you like to yell out one of those names, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail? Telepathy, wine improver, another free energy claim, Aquapol, rising damp repeller, cell phone radiation.
Lift 3, please.
Lift 3, okay. Cell phone radiation protector. Pest repeller, where was lift 3? Maybe it was after Mind Body. Anyway, I've got to show you this one. I can't resist. Mind Body Spirit Festival in Australia we sometimes go to. And you can have a personal reading for $50 an hour to suit you. And I thought, this is great. So I went along for a psychic reading, and this is the reader I thought I would get. And this is the one I actually got. Well, that's my story. Okay. Anyway, the short answer to that is I got thrown out of that because I went around questioning all their claims, and the security guards followed me around and eventually asked me to leave. So it's not so good. Okay, here we are. Cell phone radiation protector. This is a device which you can buy for $75, I think it is, and you stick it on the back of your cell phone and it reduces your radiation exposure by 93% while not interfering with transmission to the cell phone tower. Do you believe that? No. Here's the diagram from the literature. That's without the device, where most of the radiation goes into your head, and with the device it only goes the other way. Well, having worked a lot of my life with electromagnetic radiation, I got suspicious about this. That's another of their diagrams showing you that the energy received by the base station is not affected even if it is through your head. So figure that out. So I obtained they did have real reports. A lot of these people do produce real scientific reports. So this was by a Victorian company called the EMC for electromagnetic compatibility, and they produced their report, and they tested it with the device attached on the back of a phone. And this is how they do the test. I used to do these tests myself in previous career. So you can see there on the bottom there's the cell phone clamped in the device, and there's an artificial head above it, and it's got sensors inside the head, and it measures the amount of radiation going into the head. It's called the SAR, the specific absorption rate in English. Any of you heard of that? Cell phone taste for cell phone safety? Yep. And without the head, it's transmitting simply from the cell phone to the receiver in the background in an anechoic chamber that gets rid of spurious inflections in the room. And they produced a polar plot of the device showing that there was no significant loss of power due to their device, but to the cell phone tower, however, there was a great loss of power into the head, the results. So I was very puzzled by this, and I could only conclude that from the dates on the test, they were done about a month apart. Now, why didn't they do the two tests with the one device on the one occasion? I suggest that they produced a different device for the tests through the head and direct to the tower. But I didn't have any proof of this, so I couldn't publish that, because, as I said before, if you publish something, you have to have backup, and it was only circumstantial evidence. So that was the story there. Couldn't prove it, didn't publish it. All the others, most of the others we published. Now, there's a few things that I have been bamboozled or floored or stumped by. If I said something stumped me, would you know what I meant? And do you know the origin of that term? Well, I believe it originated in Australia, because I grew up on a farm in Australia, and when we were ploughing the fields, we used tractors, but my ancestors used horses. You're ploughing the field, and if it hits a tree stump, you come to a complete stop. And in fact, the Australians invented the stump jump plough, which you can look up on Google. Who's heard of the stump jump plough? It means that if the horse-drawn one, if it hits the stump, that particular tine kicks up, goes over the stump and comes down again. So that stops the plough being stumped by a stump. So I claim that's the origin of the term stumped. So have I ever been stumped? I went to a talk once on, usually the talks I go to have got lots of believers there. A visitor said, I can tell the time without using a watch. I said, great, what time is it? He said, it's 2:45. I said, my phone says it's 3:10. And he said, oh, it usually works. So no, it didn't get the money. Extraterrestrials, this is one of my favourites. I was giving a talk on the skeptics. I described a claim by an old radio amateur. He wrote it up in a self-published book. He listened for long periods at the sky. Can you imagine a radio amateur sitting in his shack all night, tuning his dials and listening to the universe? He said that he noticed some specific signals, and he noticed a graph. I've recreated the graph because I don't have it anymore, but he plotted the frequency versus the time of arrival of these signals, and he compared that with the star map and found it matched the star map. So his claim was that this pattern is the aliens telling me where they are from. He said it's Booty's Major. Now the story doesn't end there, because what happened was, at this particular talk, someone in the talk said, ho, 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 that's silly. And I said, why do you say that? And he said, because I know these aliens and they really come from Beetlejuice. So yes, that floored me or stumped me again, yes. Okay, joke time. What do you call an alien with 3 balls? Extraterrestrial. Do I need to translate that? Okay, I think we might leave it there. So, would we like to finish the talk, and we can have discussion and any questions you might have.
Thanks a lot.